Good evening, Monterey Bay. It's time for Talk of the Bay, KSQD's evening talk show covering issues and topics of interest to the folks around the Monterey Bay, of, for, and about the people, not the big corporate interests. We're very happy to be serving you, and we're really happy to be serving you on our new frequencies. We'd like to welcome residents in Salinas, Monterey, and Watsonville, now heard at 89.5 and 89.7, on top of being heard at 90.7 FM. I'm your Thursday evening host, Rachel Ann Goodman. It's my great pleasure to be here with you behind the microphone as we look toward this evening's Talk of the Bay. So what shall we talk about? How about recovering from the CZU fires? Yes, we're still recovering. Believe it or not, it's going to be a long road, and for some institutions and ecosystems, it's going to be a very long haul. But the good news is it is happening. We're going to be hearing from two people very involved with Big Basin State Park in our first segment. And then in the second segment, we will have some mystery guests, as well as a tribute to the late, great Robbie Robertson. We had a tribute earlier by Eric Nelson. I'll do my own. And we want to thank you for listening and supporting community radio, the radio that responds to you. You're listening to KSQD Santa Cruz and KSQD Prunedale. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, and this is Talk of the Bay. And welcome to the program. This is a place where we explore topics of interest and affecting the people around the Monterey Bay. And what better story to tell than the story of Big Basin Redwood State Park, the oldest of California state parks. And here to talk about that with me are two people who are deeply involved with this particular place in time now. That is Bonny Hawley. She's Executive Director of Friends of the Santa Cruz State Parks. Welcome, Bonny.
Thanks for having us, Rachel.
Great to have you here. And Erin Dunning. She is an interpreter for Big Basin State Park.
Wonderful to be here.
Wonderful to have you. So, Bonny, I'll start with you. This park goes back before it was a state park. The land was native land. Can you talk about the kind of a couple of the points in history that led up to this being created as one of the first state parks, the first state park in the state of California?
Well, it's actually the oldest state park. The first state park was Yosemite, and that was given back to the federal government. So it's the longest continuous state park in California. A little bit of trivia.
Thank you.
So the lands where the park is located were originally the homelands of the Kirosti and the Chitoni tribes, which were the ancestral relatives of today's Amamutsan tribal band and also the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. More recently, there was a citizens campaign in the early 1900s to save the redwoods, and it was originally acquired by state parks and became a state park in 1902. There was a huge campaign by citizens, both locally in Santa Cruz, at Stanford, the San Jose Women's Club, and across California to save those redwoods from the axe. And that story is written about in Tracy Bliss's books, Big Basin Redwood Forest, that was put out last year, and it goes into the amazing history of the activism that created that park, in many cases led by women. So it's a fascinating story.
When you drive north, all the way through California and see these beautiful redwood forests, they have the names of a lot of women on them, these groves.
Yes.
Women were really the spearhead of saving these forests from the axe. And just to give it context, 1906, the earthquake, these hills in Santa Cruz were razed to the ground. Really, there was nothing left.
Yes.
Except for these little pockets that were saved.
Yes.
How did Big Basin not get spared in the first place is one question I have.
Well, it was fairly impenetrable. Of course, people had lived there and people visited there, but the story of how it was saved is just an amazing story of people coming together and working at all levels, both through these women's clubs and women like Josephine Clifford McCracken, who wrote for the local newspaper, and just getting people fired up. There were also people who were naturalists at Stanford who made regular trips there with their students. It was an amazing story of people coming together.
When you came into the park, there was a visitor center. There were these amazing large groves of very old growth redwood. People from all over the world would come here over generations, all the way back to the beginning of the park, to marvel at these wonders of nature that, the world doesn't have. They are only here. And Erin, I know as a child you told me, and maybe you could tell our listeners, a few stories about what that was like for such a small person to look up at these great giants.
Sure. To give context, I grew up in a pretty big family up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, and our family vacations were spent camping in parks all over California especially. And one of my more fond memories, I wasn't super small, I was about 15, and I came camping with my mother and my aunt and my younger sister, and we had a girls' trip. We would do that pretty frequently for the summers, and so it was just the 5 of us, and I remember hiking out to Berry Creek Falls. I actually have some photos of me back in the day, long before cell phones, and I actually used one of those photos in my interview for my current position, talking about how impactful that in particular, that trip was when I was a teenager, falling in love with the redwoods and the falls out there, and just bonding with my family and my friend that came with me. That was a really critical time in my life, and inspired me to go into parks later on.
You and I have a similar story, having been camping with my family all over California as a child, and then wanting to become one of those people with the brown hat and the beige shirt on. I took a different path, but that was one of my dreams, and it's nice to see people still having those dreams and accomplishing them. I lived in a little teeny cabin. I did get to the park aid level. I lived in a tiny cabin behind the headquarters for a summer, and kind of lived out the dream of being a hermit. And then I would see tons of people all day, reserving their campsites and patrolling. But it's a magic place, and I want to get to the fire in a moment, but I still want to stay with our memories for a while of what it was like, just to remember, bring that back in our listeners' minds. Bonnie, what's your story and your experience with redwoods? What's your relationship to this park?
Well, I was born on the East Coast and I was raised in the Midwest, so I have not been in California all my life. So the first time I saw a redwood was in Muir Woods. I lived in San Francisco at the time, and I just remember being amazed. I'm also a big fan of the movie Vertigo, and Vertigo was partly filmed in Big Basin. So the first time I ever went to Big Basin in my position, the ranger on duty showed me a copy of the movie script from Vertigo that had been left behind when Kim Novak and Jimmy Stewart were up there. So that was just thrilling for me as a fan of that movie.
What a history past. And, Alfred Hitchcock has a very deep past here in Santa Cruz, having been inspired to write The Birds by an event he read in the newspaper while living in Scotts Valley. So,
which you can learn more about by visiting the Visitor Center at New Brighton State Beach.
Hey, lots of connections here. Redwoods are a magical thing, and I think their history is kept alive very much, or was, with all the interpretive displays. Now, getting to the present, of course, we can not very long ago recall that the fire really wiped through Big Basin. So I want to talk about that and honor some of the pictures that are in that Big Basin Redwood Forest book, because they really can't show in a small book what it was like. Tell us a little bit about the night or a couple nights before and what led up to the fires. And maybe Bonnie, you could, since you were here when it happened, kind of following it the best you could.
Yeah, maybe Erin could start and I could chime in on the aftermath.
Sure. So the fires began on August 16th of 2020. They started out toward the coast in lightning strikes. There were thousands of bolts of lightning that night. It was dry lightning, so there wasn't any rain. Summer was very hot. The temperatures were hot. Everything was dry. And at first, Big Basin didn't seem to be under threat. The fires seemed to be staying out toward the coast. It was thought that it might even be good for some of the, to clear some of the undergrowth of the fire. However, the winds shifted, those 3 fires merged into one large fire, and ultimately, a couple days later, with less than a day, burnt through 97% of the 18,000 acres of Big Basin Redwood State Park. To give context, the entire fire was about 87,000 acres. At that point, when the fire was obviously coming this way toward Big Basin, it was all about getting life out. So they evacuated completely full campgrounds. So many staff houses were there, and so all the housing, none of that was saved. Because, again, the priority was to get life out. And everyone was evacuated safely, and the rangers and everybody here did an amazing job of doing that.
One of the things I remember reading during that time, and we were evacuated from Bonny Doon, was that the park employees had nowhere to live because that was their housing. And a lot of people were longtime residents of that park. Have any of those people relocated back to Santa Cruz County, or did they have to hire all new people?
Yeah, so one person in particular, my predecessor, Susan Blake, was the interpreter one there at the time, and she'd been there for many years, and she lost her housing in the fire. Ultimately, she ended up down at Año Nuevo State Park, and I'm still in contact. I'm in contact with her, learning about this job. I'm relatively new here, just been here since April. So again, all that housing was lost, and I believe most of the employees were able to find other housing. I don't know how many are still working for parks. Some of our maintenance folks are still working for parks, but not living there in Big Basin anymore.
Right.
So if you think back in time to 3 years ago, that was really the height of COVID, and parks were one of the only things that there was to do that felt safe. You were outside, so those campgrounds that were in the core area were very full, and the rangers and all the other staff on duty did an amazing job of getting everyone evacuated. A good sidelight of the fact that we were in the midst of COVID was that there were no people in the backcountry trails and campgrounds, so that was not something that had to be dealt with. But the people who were being so heroic that day and helping people get out, they had to really focus on their job and not really think about their own homes that were under threat. And one of the things that Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks was so proud to do after the fire was to turn to the community to raise money for our fire recovery fund, and we were able to give immediate cash grants to 29 state parks and Friends employees who lost homes and cars and other really important things in their lives. And donations came in from all over the country and in some cases all over the world. We got a donation from someone in Australia who said, "We know what it's like to live with wildfire."
Wow. It was emotional. I mean, not just because it's your childhood memories going up in flame, but because we cherish these places as sacred. And there's been this myth that redwoods are built to withstand fire and that they can live through anything. They're even called sempervirens, which means ever-living tree. There's this feeling of loss that sweeps through the community when they hear that Big Basin is gone. That was the news. On top of other news, we were watching the losses, just sort of tick up every time you turned on the news. There'd be another iconic place in California, and this was our turn to lose these places. But I want to ask you, Erin, if you think we've lost them or if they're just in some sort of transition state.
Yeah, I would say absolutely we have not lost them. It's actually estimated that 95% of our redwoods within Big Basin State Park have survived the fire. Coast redwoods are an amazing species. They're only found from Big Sur up to 7 miles inside the Oregon coast and just along the coast. It's the only place in the world they're found. They're the tallest trees in the world, and they are designed to withstand fire. They have been through fires over the last, many thousands of years. They've been around since the last ice age. However, this particular fire was so hot and so fast and so devastating due to the warming climate, really. Everything was so dry that there was what's called a crown fire. So the fires went up into the tallest parts of the trees. Coast redwoods are adapted to be resistant to fire because they're their branches are pretty high up. They're not close to the ground, and fires that historically have come through have not necessarily gone up into the crown, to the top, to the canopy of the trees. In fact, the indigenous people throughout California and the country used fire to manage the land in a responsible way. And so back to the current state, it's really incredible to visit. It's beautiful. I hadn't been there since I was actually a young adult, and I camped there as well. And when I started here in April, I came into this forest not knowing what to expect. And it's really beautiful, the contrast of the charred black trunks filled with new growth. They're sprouting from the root system. Those are baby trees of the mama trees. They are clones of those trees. And they're sprouting throughout the top of the tree also that will turn into branches. So it's a very stark contrast of the charred black trunks with the beautiful green new growth. The fires, soon after the fires, within months, the trees were sprouting. They know what to do to come back.
Bonnie, I'm wondering, how soon did you get up there after the fire, and what was your first impression like when you did?
I had the opportunity to go up just a few weeks after the fire, and it was that day you may remember when the sky was orange and it was very creepy out. It's sort of like a Martianscape. Well, I was in the park that day and everything was sepia or gray. And there was no signs of life. There were no birds. All of the buildings were gone. And of course, that fire continued to smolder for over a year in different places in the park. So it was surreal. It was emotional. But as Erin has pointed out, the trees and the wildlife started back very quickly. And if you go up there now, after the initial kind of shock of not seeing the buildings that you're used to seeing and not seeing that really thick canopy that you're used to, there is an incredible beauty in the resilience and the regrowth that's happening. There are wildflowers growing that haven't been there in years. The forest floor is covered with ferns and ceanothus, and it is amazing. And I really invite people to come back if they haven't visited the park since the fire, and also to keep coming back because it keeps changing. Every couple of months you'll see something new, and it's really inspiring.
It kind of could be a metaphor for our own resilience in the face of these changes that are going to be sweeping us, to watch these trees come back.
Indeed.
And blossom. Let's talk a little bit about the natural history of a burn recovery. I'd be curious to know what you know as a ranger. So I live in the redwood forest too, but a little higher up, so it's more tan oaky. And what's there is ceanothus. Is there sort of a progression we can expect of these plant species that will change, and how fast will that process take? Like the redwood trees are going through their own metamorphosis of sprouting, as you just described. What's happening in the rest of the forest on the floor? Because that burned, and in my land, the ceanothus is solid. It's just this massive thing that we're overwhelmed by on our property. Is that just like the first guard of a changing landscape?
Yeah, ceanothus is what's known as a fire follower, so it comes in after fires. There's some other fire followers in the park, such as bush poppy, which is beautiful, delicate yellow flower. And that's a natural thing to happen after a big fire, is those native plants come in strong. And as Bonnie mentioned, amazingly beautiful wildflowers. We still have a few in bloom. Sticky monkey flower is one of my favorites, a little orange flower. You mentioned tan oak. So tan oak is a tree that is not so much resistant to fire in that the tree itself is not going to make it if it burns, but it's very resilient. And you can, even just in the headquarters area of the park, if you walk the half-mile loop called the Redwood Loop, you'll see tan oak shoots coming up from the root system throughout the loop and throughout the park. Another species in the redwood forest is the Douglas fir, which did not fare so well. Any of those that were burnt did not make it. So that species, the Douglas fir, and we had old growth there in the park as well, and those don't come back. But the forest floor has changed from what you may imagine. A redwood forest floor typically has a lot of sorrel, which looks like that clover with the little purple flowers. That's not there so much. It's no longer shaded as it was. The temperature just walking into the forest is going to feel hotter than what you might imagine. There's also a lot of grasses that are there now that is not typical. And as the canopy returns, the leaves on the redwoods, as the shade comes back, which is decades to come, those grasses will be choked out and more of the native habitat will come back.
Redwood trees have two things you mentioned, this sprouting from the roots, and then there's these fuzzy things. Those seem to be dying off, some of them in our forest up in Fall Creek where I live near, but what's going to happen? Are they going to become bushes, those redwood trees, or are they going to sprout new giant limbs like they used to have?
Sure, to bring in a couple of scientific words, that sprouting from the bottom of the trees is actually called basal sprouting, and it's coming, as I mentioned earlier, straight from the root system. And if you go into the forest, you'll see rings all around the mother tree of those basal sprouts, and they're, some of them are 15 feet or more tall just in 3 years. And those will become trees someday. They'll thin themselves out as they get taller. And as far as the sprouting up on the top of the tree, we call it bottle brushing or poodling, because that's kind of what it looks like. I like to think of them as Dr. Seuss trees, and that's actually called epicormic sprouting. And those will become branches, and they will self-prune themselves. So those, again, decades to come, and it'll take a very long time before it looks like what a typical redwood forest that hasn't been burnt in so long will look like. Just a plug for one of our other state parks is Henry Howell Redwoods, which is in Felton. It's a really great way to see the difference in a park that hasn't burnt. You mentioned the Fall Creek unit, that part of Henry Howell did burn, but in the CZU fire, but the main part of Henry Howell did not. So, and they have a loop that's just under a mile that you can walk around and see the lush green and redwood forest with the sorrel, as I mentioned, versus the Big Basin that has burnt just 3 years ago.
Bonnie, you probably know something about the human side of things because Friends of the Park supports a lot of that activity, the interpretive activity and elsewise. How big of a tourist draw are these redwood parks for Santa Cruz County? Are they like a huge part of our economy?
Visitor services are a huge part of our local economy. The beaches, the forests, the historic parks, there's really something here for everyone, and we're so lucky locally to get to experience that, but people do come from all over the world to visit our redwoods. And as Erin mentioned, the park has been reopened for just over a year. We celebrated the anniversary on July 22nd. And before the fire, there were upwards of 1 million visitors a year to Big Basin.
Wow.
And it often, to me, felt like I was at a national park. There was traffic, there were people, there was all kinds of activity, and you had to go quite a ways to get some peace and quiet. It's just the opposite of that now. When we were getting ready to reopen the park, the district asked Friends if we would create a reservation system that people could access both online and by phone. So we created that reservation system to keep the number of people down. So if you make a reservation, you can guarantee access at that'smypark.org. Since the park reopened, we've welcomed over 47,000 visitors, which is way short of 1 million, but when you go up there, you can have a really peaceful experience.
That's a wonderful system. I wish all the parks, including the national parks, would adopt that. For a while, Yosemite had it. It still felt busy, but we somehow got in and it was way different.
Yes.
Yeah. Zion has a thing where you can't drive in anymore. You have to take a shuttle bus.
Mm-hmm. Maybe
we'll do that.
Yeah, that is in the planning process. The Reimagining Big Basin campaign, which you can check out at reimaginingbigbasin.org. There's actually a survey there that'll be open through September 10th for the public to give input into what you'd like to see happen at Big Basin. Two of the largest priorities through this campaign that's been going since really just after the fire is to prioritize the health of the forest. And one of the things that's in the works is that there won't be the same sort of building infrastructure down in the headquarters area that there was prior to the fire. And a shuttle system is one of the goals, and that the main park entrance will be just a few miles outside of the park, a place called Saddle Mountain. and that will be where like the main welcome areas are, and that there will be shuttles down into the old growth. And a way you can limit your impact even now is to take the bus. The Santa Cruz Metro has a bus that goes on the weekends all the way out to Big Basin. You don't need parking reservations for that, and you're not driving, and it's a great way to get around Santa Cruz County, but it does, as I mentioned, go out to the park through the beginning of September. And in the future, they're actually looking at expanding that shuttle system, not just from the Saddle Mountain entrance area, but possibly from as far back as Scotts Valley on that metro, with dedicated buses to take folks into Big Basin. You mentioned Zion, and I think that's a great example. So that's in the works too.
That's great to know. Let me reintroduce you if you just joined me here on Talk of the Bay. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. This is KSQD and KSQT Community Radio for the Monterey Bay area. I'm speaking with Bonny Hawley. She is the Executive Director of Friends of the Santa Cruz State Parks, and Erin Dunning, an interpreter with Big Basin State Park. And we're talking about the recovery and reinvigoration of the oldest state park in California, Big Basin Redwoods. So 1 million visitors was who used to come here, and now it's like 47,000. Is that bad for tourism in the area, or are they just going to come anyway to the other parks?
Well, I think Henry Cowell has experienced an upsurge in visitation, and that's definitely an impact that we've observed. And
Vicente Redwoods is open now, but that's kind of on reservation basis as well, right?
I believe so.
And Cochoni Coast Dairies ever going to be a park? Ever going to get access? Who knows? That's a whole other story we'll do another time. But us hikers have been waiting to get in there for a really long time, and it just keeps getting delayed. So we'll just enjoy the parks that are open for now, but it would be nice to have it spread around a bit so that any of these parks aren't so impacted.
Yep. There's also a great new opportunity that just opened a few weeks ago for coastal area camping at the Rancho del Oso entrance to Big Basin. There is a equestrian camp there, a small camp that's just near, or just across the street from the beach, and that's been temporarily repurposed as walk-in and bike-in camping. So you can also go on our website, that'smypark.org, and make a reservation for those sites, and it's just opened, and it's really beautiful.
Wow, I have not been up that canyon since it closed, since the fire, and it's open now for hiking?
No.
Okay.
There,
you can camp, but
you can camp
hike
there, but you can't go. You can't go up. There are crews working every day on reopening trails. There are miles of fire roads and also trails open, but the full skyline to the sea is not open.
I was going to ask that, so you answered that question. Did you want to add to any of that?
Sure. Just as to the trails, currently we have about 4 miles of trails and 18 miles of fire roads that have opened. The winter storms this last winter impacted that trail system as well. So trail crews are working even now. That's state and district level state parks trail crews, California Conservation Corps volunteer trail crews. And as those areas become safe, they will become open to the public. It's going to be a long time before the whole trail system is back, especially people have fond memories of the skyline to the sea going all the way from Big Basin, from the headquarters over to the coast. That's going to be many years down the road.
How about Berry Creek Falls?
That's going to be a while too. The infrastructure, there were bridges and whatnot that are gone from the fire. So, just to give a sense of scale, just the fire road system alone, 20,000 trees have already been removed within 150 feet of those roads. So the park was hit hard, first with the fire and then with these atmospheric rivers this last winter, which again points toward climate warming, and all of that is a part of that. Also, I wanted to mention camping. People are asking about camping. I get that question just about every day. When's the camping coming back? That unfortunately is going to be a while too, but there are plans for camping, not in the old growth as there were before, and again to prioritize the health of the forest, but there will be camping and it will return, and we're waiting to see how all that plays out. But the Reimagining Big Basin campaign, that is definitely a priority too, is bringing that camping back.
That seems to be kind of one of the main priorities for the public is to be able to stay in the forest, because some people travel from so far away. They want to experience it for more than a few hours. So I can see why that is a demand or a hope in people's minds, that they can do it. So for those fire roads, can people bike on them? Is that something, mountain biking, that they can do?
Sure, yeah. Bicycles are allowed on the fire roads. And as I mentioned, there's about 18 miles open right now. If you come in on a horse from the road, you're welcome to, but there's no horse trailer parking yet. So that's a little bit of a challenge. But
yeah, you have to ride your horse up
ride your horse from Boulder Creek. Yeah.
Oh, there's some hardcore people that would probably find a way through the backwoods to get there.
Sure. But yeah, bicycling is open on those fire roads, and there's lots of ways to hike around. There's some beautiful trails. If you want to bring your four-legged friend, there is about a mile of paved road right from the down in the headquarters area where you can take your pup. They're not allowed.
You were talking about my cat.
Well, cats too, I suppose.
You said 4 legs.
On a leash.
Anything with 4 legs, my frog.
They would need to be on a leash and
right.
Stay on that paved road.
All right. We'll make sure they do that. I was thinking about another question. Oh, Little Basin. Now, that was acquired by the state parks. Is that correct? But it also burned.
Correct. It did burn. And that is the future home, hopefully, of some group recreation up there. It's very close to where the Saddle Mountain future entrance will be. So that's in the plans as well.
Now, that used to be Hewlett-Packard's private campground. All the campground part just burned, or is it still there?
It's gone. The infrastructure is gone. I was actually up there not too long ago. All the buildings are gone. You can see reminiscences of like the basketball court, and a few signs remain here and there. But that's another area where the trees, there's not as many redwoods in there. It's other trees that did not make it. But yeah, that's the future home of part of Big Basin as well.
Okay, it's a lot of change to track for listeners here who might be interested in visiting Big Basin. Any final thoughts that you'd like to leave the public with about this iconic park, that maybe some facts that they didn't know about what it's like now?
Well, not so much what it's like now, but I really like to point out what I think is a miracle, that park opened within 2 years of 97% of it burning. And all of that recovery work happened in the midst of COVID. So the government, state parks as an entity, other state agencies partnered with a bunch of other nonprofits like Mountain Parks Foundation, Save the Redwoods League, Sempervirens Fund, Parks California, and Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks, as well as just rank and file community volunteers, the California Conservation Corps. Everybody rolled up their sleeves to get that park open in record time. And that kind of nonprofit government partnership continues to this day in the operation of that park. And I think the community should really be proud of that volunteer ethic that we have here in Santa Cruz County in the Monterey Bay area to really pull together when times are tough. And I just also really urge people to come visit and visit often. And it's a really great place to relax and renew and watch the miracle of nature unfold.
Bonny Hawley, you've said it so well, but because we're community radio, are there ways for people to get involved as community members? We always like to connect people to things they could do, to be part of the recovery.
Absolutely. Well, Erin mentioned the reimagining process. So again, if you go to reimaginingbigbasin.org, there is a survey, and there are a lot of very detailed questions about what people would like to see in the future there as far as camping and visitor experiences. You can visit the park, you can buy merchandise, you can buy the book that I mentioned by Tracy Bliss to learn the history of the park, you can donate, but just get involved in whatever way feels right to you.
Do they have work days? People can come out and do trail work?
Yeah, so you're definitely welcome to look into becoming a volunteer for California State Parks. You can check out the California State Park website to find more information about that. You can, we do have many volunteers that are still with us, and that there's a rich history of docents at Big Basin, and gratefully we have some of them have been coming this summer to help out. I also just want to put a plug in for programs. Even now on the weekends, we have our little visitor center. I call it a visitor box made out of an old shipping container, or not an old shipping container, but
It's a new shipping container.
It's a new shipping container. It's a beautiful little visitor center, and we have temporary panels that talk quite a bit about the park. And we're open 10 to 4. We have staff there every day but Tuesday. And on the weekends right now, you can come out and do a guided walk around the Redwood Loop at 11 a.m. on Saturday and Sunday. We're looking to continue that through the fall if we can. And just real quick, you mentioned fun facts about the park. And I wanted to tell you one, in that you had mentioned that so many of the wildlife have returned. So most of the wildlife that was here prior to the park has returned to the park, including mountain lions and bobcats and coyote and the banana slug. So I like to tell kids the banana slugs didn't leave. It would have been too long of a commute. They survived the fire by burrowing themselves deep down in the ground. They were already deep underground. That's what they do when it's really hot. They like a lot cooler weather. And so all of our banana slugs that are in the park, the record sighting is 42 in a day this last spring. And you're not likely to see them right now, but they were already underground during the fire. And so all of our current ones are descended from those banana slugs. So just a plug for some banana slugs. Come out and find them.
Go slugs. Go slugs. And Bonnie, I saw this flyer. This is a little unrelated, but it is related to the parks, that there's going to be a good old-fashioned campfire event. Is that something you're involved with?
Is that at the Santa Cruz Mission State Historic Park? That is other great programming done by state park interpreters. And if you go either to that'smypark.org or the state park website, there are amazing activities, guided walks, junior rangers, crafts, yoga, you name it, in a park near you.
Great. Well, thank you both for coming in today. It's been a great pleasure. Erin Dunning, interpreter for State of California State Parks, Big Basin. Bonny Hawley, executive director of the Friends of Santa Cruz Parks. Thank you both for being here today on K-Squid.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
This is